looking up at all these herds of buffalo on the cliffs. And normally the Native Americans would sort of drive these buffaloes, scare them off of this herds over this cliff, and they would all fall down, sort of break their backs and so forth, and then they would have all this buffalo meat to eat and live on and so forth. But for some reason this year, the buffalo herds would drive up to the edge of the precipice and stop. They wouldn't go over. So the tribe was in danger of starving. So the girl goes out, and she sort of looks up to them and says, "Oh, if only you would all come pouring over, then I would marry one of you." So then, sure enough, they all come pouring over, and then the sort of shaman, the animal master of the herd, walks over and says, "Okay, girlie, we're off," and he carries her off. Meanwhile, the father is back, and he wonders what's happened to his daughter, and he thinks he better go find out. So he goes off on a little trail, and a little magpie comes floating along, and he says, "Have you seen my daughter?" And the magpie says, "Yes, actually, I have, and I can show you where she's at." So he leads the father over to where the herd is, and he spies the herd and sees them over there. And the daughter comes over, and she says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "Well, I've come to take you back." And she says, No, you can't do that. I've made an agreement here. I have to work this out with these animals. Just go back, and I'll handle this." And she's gone to get a drink. She's broken off the buffalo horn, her husband, buffalo, and she's gone to fill up the horn and get a drink of water for him to carry it back. That's what brought her to the hole to begin with. So she goes back with this full horn of water. The buffalo husband takes it. He says, "I smell a human." And she says, No, it's just me." And he says, No, I smell someone else." And so he gets up his big buffalo buddies, and they all go out, they find the father, and they kill him. They trample him to death. So the father's all mashed up into the ground, and buffalo husband returns back to the girl, and she's all crying and tearing, and he says, what's the problem? She says, "Well, he was my father." He says, "Well, how do you think we feel every year, when we pour ourselves over the cliffs for you guys? We go through the same process." And he says, "Tell you what," apparently he was a sort of compassionate buffalo. He said, "Tell you what, if you can go back over there, and if you can bring your father back to life, then I'll let you go." And she says, "All right." She goes back over, and she takes a sort of buffalo cloth, and she lays it over the mashed up bits and pieces and starts singing a song. And then she looks under, and the father is sort of reconstituting himself. He needs a little more singing, continues singing, lifts up the rug, and he's back. And so the buffalo says, "That's impressive," to her, and says, "If you teach us," or he says, "if you can perform this song that we're going to teach to you, and perform it, the same magical song that you used to resurrect your father, and you can perform our song, which we will now teach to you, and it will have the effect of magically bringing us back to life every time we pour ourselves over these cliffs." And so they teach her the buffalo song, and that's when they do the buffalo dance around the fire that you see, in the movies nowadays, the Kevin Costner movie and so forth. That's what they're doing. And so you see this recognition of a covenant between the animal world and the human world, such that there's this mutual agreement. And Campbell says that wipes out any sense of guilt that man is killing in order to survive. Because man now has, as Steiner says, has self-consciousness. The animals don't have self-consciousness. And along with that comes a sense of awareness now of what you're doing to survive. Life implies killing. It implies sexual reproduction. It implies sacrifice. It implies stealing other lives in order to survive. And life has been doing this forever, long before the human ego came along, at least in the classical sort of Darwinian model, not Steiner's model. In Steiner's model, the human was there before anything came in. But in any respect, then, this is the magical consciousness structure. And the key thing for Gebser here is this web motif, because he says you can trace this as you go up through civilization. The magical structure continues every time you have this interwovenness, this web motif. This is a battle scene that's represented from the tomb of Tutankhamun. So this is clear up to 1300 BC, and you still have this sense of interwovenness, man being interwoven with everything else. And over here on a Greek vase painting, you have the same sort of embeddedness. Man is still embedded within the background of nature, and on these two images, another Greek image, and then an image going down here, clear up into 1300 AD. So the magical structure continues. And Gebser says there's an efficient and a deficient mode with respect to each of these structures. And the danger today is regressing to these earlier modes of consciousness, specifically the deficient aspect of it. The efficient aspect of the magical consciousness structure is, as we have just seen, the performing of these spells to bring about this will of nature and the events that you want to have happen. But the deficient aspect of it is sort of black magic and sorcery, and the regression to sort of Anytime you get a regression to a collective mob psychology, you're back into the magical structure of consciousness. And that's the big danger in the 20th century, is this sort of regression to this group mentality with mob psychology. Here's an image where he just throws in to show you how a man first begins to extricate himself from the background. We're already moving, here we're into the mythical consciousness structure, just to jump ahead for a moment. Nature is dropping down below here. There's a separation between the heavens and the earth, and this is when we begin to get the myth of the separation of the world parents that we started out with, that led to the great chain of being. The separation of the world parents, and also the little butterfly here is the soul. The soul is discovered in the mythical consciousness structure. In the magical consciousness structure, man is outer directed toward nature. There is no real sense of soul. Everything is interwoven with everything else. It's one giant soul. But the sort of introverted discovery of the soul that exists within man begins to take place for Gebser within the consciousness structure of the mythical world. And here's the little feather headdress where the bird is associated with the heavens, and then you have the little plant world down below. That's from Minos, Crete. But now one other important motif about the magical structure before we move into the mythical is this absence of a mouth that turns up all over the place. These are the beings, by the way, these are the Australian spirit beings that I think are returning today as extraterrestrials. I think they're the same beings, rather. And one of the clues is that when you look at these descriptions in our popular culture and in our films of these beings, they have mouths, but the mouths are very, very downplayed. They're almost, non-existent. And the emphasis is on the head. Instead of this halo, you just have these large, round, bulbous heads. But even without that, they still look like these beings, in my opinion. But now, and this is a little Irish miniature from Dover in the 9th century. So this mouthless motif goes all over the world. And here it goes as far back as you can see into the Paleolithic goddess figurines. And there in particular, this is one of the first representations of a human head. And everything is there except for the mouth. And indeed, on most of these Paleolithic goddess statues, there is no mouth. And in fact, if you look at the books of Maria Gimbutas, the ones that she studied from Old Europe, some of those carvings have mouths, but most of them do not. Some do and some don't. Here, almost none of them do. So what's the significance of this? Gebser says the mouth, the absence of a mouth, indicates that in the magical consciousness structure, communication is essentially nonverbal. That is to say that it is embedded within the group collectivity. Just as a flock of birds moving through the air doesn't require a mouth for each one to communicate to the other, they sort of have this nonverbal field effect whereby they communicate. So too in the case of magical man, communication was primarily through the means of things like telepathy, dance, ritual. It was very nonverbal and very much emphasized the group soul, the we, the single sort of mind that is shared by the group, where communication doesn't require verbiage. So then that's the part of the magical consciousness structure. So then if we're to sort of draw these things out on the blackboard, which is probably the best way to do this. Gebser says once we come to the mythical consciousness structure, the first thing that strikes us is the word myth itself, because the etymology of the word comes from the word for mouth. And now we begin to get the appearance of the mouth in the mythical consciousness structure. Myths come from the mouth because they are oral tales that are told. And this is not to say, I don't think Gebser means to say that there aren't stories that were told in the magical consciousness structure. I'm sure there were, but the emphasis wasn't on those types of cosmological world myths of the separation of the world parents and so forth that you get in the mythical consciousness structure. Just briefly, he says, myth is derived from the Greek word mythos, which means a spoken utterance, and mytheomai, which is a verb for to speak. But the key with the mythical consciousness structure is that everything is dualistic. Everything is polarized. And so there's a dual etymology from the word myth that relates to the word, I think the Sanskrit word or Latin word is mutus, which means the opposite of to speak, to remain silent. So there's this inherent ambiguity in the word myth that has to do with speaking and silence. And this eventually leads to the mysteries and the word mystery and the mystery cults, where